Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for today's IELTS academic writing lesson. Today, we are talking about how to write about changes in data. And this is going to focus on the academic version of the exam, Writing Task 1. So we're going to first look at some great vocabulary, great synonyms, and some grammar that you should be using when you are writing about changes in data. This skill is extremely important for writing a report on a line graph because lines in a graph are constantly changing to different values. So of course we'll be looking at line graphs. We're also going to be looking at bar charts and pie charts. After we look at all of our language and our grammar, we're going to look at two exercises that we can do together and really examine which words should be used to talk about these changes. So let's get started with some vocabulary. Now, first we're going to focus on how to talk about an increase in value. Now we're going to look at some examples, but basically an increase in value can be represented by an upward movement of a line or an upward trend in your bar charts, for example. So we see increase as a verb and then increase as a noun. If you're going to use it as a noun, remember to use your article an. Then we have rise, grow, surge, soar, skyrocket, leap, and peak. So we're going to go through these one by one. And first we're going to just look at a very common example and talk about from and to. So let's look at our first example here. We see the working age population as a percentage of the total in 4 countries since 1960. And we've got our countries here: France, United States, Japan, and Germany. Now look here, we have from and to in red. So we're going to focus on Japan in this particular example. It is the green line. So we're going to look at how we can talk about this increase from 65 to 70. So let's look here at the bottom for a couple of examples. First off, we see Japan's working age population increased. So we see increase as a verb, increased from 65% to 70% between 1960 and 1990. So this is very simple. We're using increase as a verb, and of course we have our lovely from and to. So we know the starting point is 65 and the end point is 70. So the prepositions from and to are perfect to describe this increase. However, you can also report on the amount of changes between the 2 points, and with that we would use by. So the amount of change is 5% because we're looking at 65 to 70. So you can also say this in a different way without using from and to. And you could say Japan's working age population increased by 5% between 1960 and 1990. So these are basically two ways to say the same thing. One, however, would just showcase your knowledge of the prepositions from and to, and the other would showcase your knowledge about 5. Just remember the rule here. If you've got from and to, you have 2 numbers, and by is using the amount of change between the 2 points, which in this case is 5%. Okay, now like I said earlier, we can also use increase as a noun. So let's look at an example of using increase as a noun. So we see here, Japan's working age population saw, showed, experienced, so you can use either one of these in green, an increase of 5% between 1960 and 1990. So if you use increase as a noun, obviously you'll need another verb to go along with that noun. And some really great examples are saw an increase, showed an increase, or of course, experienced an increase. I would definitely make note of these 3 verbs. They are very common to use with the noun of increase. And of course, you want to say an increase of because you're looking at a specific percent, a specific number. Another option we could also say there was a 5% increase in Japan's working age population between 1960 and 1990. Same example here, we're using a noun. We're talking about the amount of change from 1960 to 1990. Again, we see a 5% increase, so the article here would change to a because it's in front of 5. And we do not need these verbs in green because we've got the verb to be as was. Also, really something important to keep in mind is the fact that we're using the past simple here because we are being specific. So we're talking about a specific moment in time, and that is 1960 and 1990. Same thing here. We see saw, showed, and experienced. These are all in the past tense because, again, we are specific, talking about a specific moment in the past, and that would call for the past simple. Now, a key point here to keep in mind is the use of the preposition of and the use of the preposition in. So, of is used when it's followed by a percentage or a number, and in is used when you want to say what is increasing. So, Japan's working age population is increasing, and here the increase is of a 5% difference. So, always make sure you're keeping your prepositions in mind. Now, you definitely don't want to be using the same word all the time. So right now we've looked at increase as a verb and increase as a noun. Let's look at some other examples. If I pull up this sentence here, we see Japan's working age population rose from 65% to 70%, or you could also say Japan's working age population grew from 65% to 70%. Now here, of course, I've got our infinitive. Of course, we're looking in the past, so I've got rose and grew for the same reason as before. We are talking about a specific moment in the past. Another example could be this one right here. It says Japan's working age population rose and grew by 5% between 1960 and 1990. So it's very simple. We are still following our rules of from and to and by. We're just changing up our words for a bit because you don't want to use the same word over and over in your report, in your writing task 1. So make sure that you are well aware of the different things you can use. Now let's think about how we can use rise and grow as a noun. So we see here Japan's working age population. Of course, we have our same verbs, saw, showed, experienced, a rise, or a growth of. So keep in mind that rise could be the noun, it could also be the verb, and grow is different. So grow is the verb and growth would be the form of the word in the noun form. So make sure you are well aware of these differences. In the second example, we see here there was a 5% rise or a 5% growth in Japan's working age population between 1960 and 1990. So again, we're still following the same rules, how you can say it in a different way, but just make sure you're paying attention to the noun and the verb form. Now we're going to look at some more advanced vocabulary. So we're going to focus on these words right here. So we have again, surge, soar, skyrocket, leap, and peak. Again, this is advanced vocabulary that you can use to help your lexical resource score in your writing. Now, just to note here, soar and skyrocket are both very strong words that describe large rises. In fact, skyrocket is more sudden, so something that perhaps is a very large increase that is never before seen in your bar chart or in your line chart. This is something sudden and perhaps unexpected, and something that you would want to make note of in your report. You probably don't need to qualify these two verbs with adverbs. We're going to talk about adverbs a bit later, but these are usually just strong enough on its own. Leap, on the other hand, shows a very large and sudden rise. It is somewhat similar to skyrocket, but leap is again something that you would not need to qualify with an adverb because it's already pretty strong on its own. And then peak is something that we're going to look at in an example. It is the largest number or the highest point. Think about a peak of a mountain. So this is a mountain here. The peak would be the very top. Also, I didn't really talk about surge. It isn't as strong as soar and skyrocket. You could probably use an adverb if you wanted to, although it is optional. So it's not as strong as soar and skyrocket and leap, but again, it is advanced, so it'd be great to use this instead of increase, rise, or grow. Basically, you want to strive for a nice mix of these terms. So now let's look at a different example. We see very drastic lines here. It shows the average daily viewing figures for Channel 1 News over a 12-month period. So we've got January to December, and we've got our times here on the right-hand side. So let's take a look at this first sentence. It says, after May, the figure for the 11 p.m. news skyrocketed, reaching its highest point at 4.1 million in August. So if we're looking at May, that's right here, we're looking at 11 p.m., so it'll be the green. And yes, after May, we see that it completely skyrocketed. So it's quite sharp as an increase, and that makes skyrocketed the perfect choice here. Its highest point, or we could also say its peak, was at 4.1 million in August. So that is a great sentence to use for skyrocketed. And of course, from August onwards, the trend reversed. So we saw that it did the opposite pattern after August. Let's look at our next sentence. It says, after May, the figure for the 11 p.m. news peaked or leapt at 4.1 million. So again, peaked is going to be the highest point. You could also say that it leapt, and it leapt at 4.1 million. So here we're actually using at to signify the last number or the highest number before it reversed. The next sentence, after May, the figure for the 11 p.m. news reached a peak of or soared at. So here I have showed you peak in the noun form. So you can use peak as both a noun and a verb. And of course, I've got our verb here, which is reached. Reach and peak, that's a great collocation. Reached a peak of, make sure you remember to use your preposition when looking at numbers. Or I also have paired soared at 4.1 million. Another sentence, we see the figure for the 11 p.m. news reached its highest point at 4.1 million in August. So I'm not really using any of these terms here, but this is just a great way to say it reached its highest point at 4.1 million. So with this sentence, we are not really talking about the change. We're talking about the end point of 4.1 million, which you can also do for this portion of the exam. So that's also something to keep in mind. Now we are going to shift focus and look at a decrease. So again, just like increase, you can use decrease as a verb or a decrease as a noun. We also have decline, fall, drop, reduce as a verb and a reduction, dip, and then plunge and plummet, which both mean to drop suddenly. So let's look at our next example. We've got average CO2 emissions per person in these 4 countries on the right-hand side. So our first sentence says CO2 emissions per person in Norway, and then I've got some great verbs in green. So I have decreased, fell, dropped, declined, were reduced, dipped, and then we have our preposition from, just over 10 tons to around 7 tons between 1985 to 1995. This is very similar to our first example about Japan because we're looking at from and to. So the rule for from and to still applies here. I just want you to take note of this passive. So we see that the CO2 emissions were reduced. We don't know how they were reduced or who reduced them from this sentence alone. And in order not to use the noun form, we've used the passive. You should be keeping a list of handy terms that do require the passive or make the most sense with the passive. So just keep that in mind. And of course, we are still using our past tense. Another way to say this, again, we can use our by, and it's the same thing. CO2 emissions per person in Norway, dipped, for example, by 3 tons. And all you really have to do is just look at Norway, which is in red. We've got 1985 at 10 and 1995 at 7. So that is a difference of 3 tons, and that's why we would use by in this case. Our next sentence has a couple different things. It says CO2 emissions per person in Norway saw, showed, and experienced A, decrease, decline, drop, fall, reduction, and dip from just over 10 tons to around 7 tons between 1985 to 1995. So remember, this is just like our other example with increases. We've got our 3 lovely verbs, saw, showed, and experienced, with the noun form of these verbs. So notice decrease is the same. They're pretty much all the same except for reduce and reduction. And we can really do without those 3 verbs that we see here by using was. So there was a decrease, decline, drop, fall, or reduction, or dip in CO2 emissions, and of course we have our from and to. So just make sure you're well aware that these 2 things are very similar. You're just changing the way you use verbs and nouns. Let's just take a quick shift here and look at future changes. So if you imagine that you are taking the exam in 2014, for example, 2015 would be in your future. And so you could write something like CO2 release in France is projected or forecasted to drop to around 8.5 tons by 2015. Lastly, let's take a look at our plunge and our plummet. So we have a different graph here. We've got typical daily demand for electricity, and our sentence says in winter, the demand for electricity in England plummets, or you could say plunges, after 10 p.m. So 10 p.m. would be right after 21. So 21 is right around here. 22, which would be 10 p.m., is right at this peak. So after 10 p.m., you see that it just plummets. It's decreasing rapidly and it's dropping suddenly. So you could say plummets or plunges after 10 p.m., reaching or hitting a low point between the morning hours of 6 and 7 o'clock. And so you see here, 6 and 7 o'clock, this is the low point. So that's why we see it reaches or it hits a low point. Or you could also say in winter, the demand for electricity in England takes a plunge. This is a great collocation. The verb take will go with plunge after 10 p.m. and again, reaching or hitting a low point. So make sure you're keeping in mind all of your collocations as well. Okay, great job. Before we get into our examples and filling in the blanks with our actual writing task 1 prompts, I just want to go over the difference between adjectives and adverbs when talking about big changes and small changes. This is something that students really struggle with because adjectives and adverbs can be extremely similar. So I've got a table here for big changes. We're going to go through that first, and I'm going to show you the adjective and the adverb. If you'd like, you could even pause it here and test yourself to see if you can come up with the adverbs and spell them correctly. I'm going to go through it now, so you can also do it with me. So we have our adjective as sharp. The adverb is sharply. Dramatic, dramatically. Rapid, rapidly. Abrupt, abruptly. Significant, significantly. Precipitous, precipitously. Now for small changes, we have our adjectives here: steady, steadily, slight, slightly, gradual, gradually, marginal, marginally, gentle, and gently. Now, something I'm not going to do in this video, but would encourage you to do, is just remember the spelling rules, because spelling is very important for your score as well. Make sure you know when to use double L's, when to get rid of your E's. This is something that you should be practicing on your own. Now let's look at this in examples. I've got example sentences here on the right. House prices rose dramatically in July. So notice how the adverb describes the verb. So dramatically shows a sudden increase in housing prices. The second one, the number of tourists visiting New York fell sharply. So we're talking about how it fell, how it decreased. Then the number of students studying economics rose gradually from 2001 to 2010. So we know that it was in increments. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic. Here we see there was a sharp increase in employee turnover after the strike. Note that sharp is an adjective, so it describes the noun, which is an increase. Here, interest in environmental issues has risen steadily over the last 10 years. This is very important because we're talking about over the last 10 years. That should include the year we are in now, so that's why we need the present perfect. Has risen steadily. So make sure you're also keeping in mind the different parts of speech, how the past tense changes to the present perfect if necessary, because this will also impact your score. Here we see the proportion of biofuels used in Germany in 2009 rose marginally from 30% to 32%. So notice how it's very small. You wouldn't use dramatically for something like this. Marginally is a great word. Next, it says there has been a precipitous drop in home sales recently. Again, we're talking about recent times, so there has been. That would be the present perfect. Precipitous would be something very sudden, so a very steep drop. And lastly, home sales are declining precipitously. In this case, we are using the adverb to talk about how things are declining. So make sure you know the difference between your adjectives and your adverbs. It's a really great clue that you see adverb. It means it is impacting the verb. An adjective is impacting the noun. This will really help your score when it comes to your lexical resource. Of course, if we take the first example, house prices rose in July. That could be true according to your graph. It wouldn't be incorrect, but rose dramatically really takes your writing to the next level, and it really makes things a bit more advanced. Okay, now here I've got our situation and verbs you can use to describe the situation. Again, this is really going to help your lexical resource and your advanced level vocabulary. Now we're going to look at an example here. We've already looked at this specific graph, but we're going to use this to talk about how we can describe these situations. So if we see that a value is remaining stable or it's remaining the same, if you look at 1 p.m., for example, you could say that it is hovering or that it hovers. That just means it stays around the same value. If the value changes frequently, like you see the yellow line at 6 p.m., you could say it fluctuates, oscillates, varies, or it swings. And if a value stops rising and remains the same, you could say something like it plateaus, it levels off, or it flattens out. I've been using the third person here. This is what it would be in the infinitive. If we look at some examples, it says, the figure for 1 p.m. news remained fairly stable, hovering at around 1.3 million throughout the year, and that is exactly the case. In this case, the second example, we see the figure for the 6 p.m. news showed some fluctuation, or you could also say fluctuated widely. And again, we've got our adverb here to describe fluctuated throughout the year, but the general trend was downwards, and it ended the year at around 3.4 million right here. Next, we see a different example, and this is looking at number of visitors per month in the various museums. Here we can say the number of people who visited the Natural History Museum, so that's blue, oscillated throughout the summer, reaching a plateau or plateaued at the beginning of July, then gradually dropped through August. But the most important thing is that you see reaching a plateau or plateaued at. So keep these two words in mind. Reaching, just like you see reaching a peak, like we looked at earlier, reaching is a great verb for plateau. And our last example here, the number of homeless people in London remained steady between 2010 and 2013. So I'm looking at London here in red. I'm looking at 2010 to 2013. It is very steady. You could also say that it hovered around 500. Then this was followed by a marginal increase from 500 to 1,000 before 2015, which is exactly what we see here. From 2015 onward, the figure for the homeless population in London leveled off. You could also say flattened out. You could also say plateaued. The important thing is that you're not overusing any of these verbs in one report. So just make sure you're familiar with all of these different ways. Now we're almost ready to get into our 2 examples. Before we do that, I want to show you just some quick ways to talk about trends. So this is an overall trend. We're not really being specific with data, but you can basically just use these very handy phrases. So for downward trend, you could say something shows a downward trend or a downward trajectory. I would definitely make it a priority to use both of these if you can in a report. Just try not to reuse one or the other. And of course, you see the same thing as upward. Let's look at some examples. Coal exports showed a downward trend through a 10-year period, or the number of cards sold showed a rapid downward trend in 2009. So downward trend, again, is a noun, so rapid would be the adjective. Looking at upward, social pursuits like watching TV and spending time with family have shown an upward trend in recent years. Again, if you have something like recent, you want to be sure to use the present perfect. And lastly, with regards to hamburgers, consumption has showed a steady upward trajectory from 10 times eaten per year to over 70 times. Now let's go ahead and just recap everything we have looked at in the first half of this video. We're going to review, and then we're going to put all of this to the test and look at our 2 examples. Okay, so great job so far following along. This is just something that you can use to really digest everything we've looked at thus far in the video. Here we have an excellent drawing, a great representation of when to use the vocabulary that we have on the right. So we've got our increases, decreases, remaining stable, changing frequently, or stopping rising and remaining the same. We've got everything we've looked at so far. You can pause here and take your notes, but this is something that you don't want to miss when it comes to using this great vocabulary. Okay, so now it's time to put all of this to the test, and we're going to look at our first exercise. So let's start here on the left-hand side. We see the bar chart shows the total number of minutes in billions of telephone calls in the UK divided into 3 categories from 1995 to 2002. Fill in the gaps with the correct word from the options. And our options are here in the box, and our report, our writing task 1, will be here on the right-hand side. So first, let's look at the options. We see stood at, stood on, precipitously, a considerable increase in, showed a similar pattern. Then in our third line, we have to, reached a peak, gradual, sharp, showed a gradual decline, steadily, at, and a marginal rise in. You really want to use all your knowledge with adverbs and adjectives and the vocabulary we looked at today. This is also a great review for grammar. So what you could do is pause here and see if you can do this on your own and see which answers you get. Not all of the options will be used, but those that are used will be used once. So again, like I said, you can pause here. If not, we can do it together. I'm going to read this with you and then explain the answers. So let's start here at our first sentence. The bar chart illustrates the total number of calls in the UK in billions of minutes with 3 call types over an 8-year period from 1995 to 2002. So that is our nice introduction. Looking at the overview paragraph, it says, overall, local fixed line calls blank by the middle of the period, then gradually declined. So if you look at fixed line calls, that's going to be our gray. And we see overall fixed line calls blank by the middle of the period. So the middle of the period would be 1998, 1999. And let's see, it starts off at around 70. And like it says here, it gradually declines. So I would say that the middle period represents the highest point, or like we looked at today, it would be a peak. So if we look at our options, we see reached a peak, and that is going to be the correct answer. Local fixed line calls reached a peak by the middle of the period, then gradually declined. I can eliminate this from our options since each answer will only be used once. Let's continue. National and international calls showed a blank rise over the whole period, with mobile calls rising considerably toward the end of the period. Now, the fact that we have a noun here as rise shows that this is going to be an adjective. Remember, not an adverb, because adverbs go with verbs. So here I'm going to be looking for an adjective. And I see my options as gradual or sharp. So if we're looking at national and international, that is the white, and we see what type of rise. Is it sudden, is it sharp, or is it gradual? And as you see, it is gradual because it increases very steadily, both mobiles and national and international. And so the correct answer here would be gradual. Let's move on to our first body paragraph regarding local fixed line calls. In 1995, they began at slightly over 70 billion minutes and rose blank to a peak of 90 billion minutes in 1999. So a clue here is we see a verb, so we know we're going to be looking for an adverb. If we look at local fixed line calls, that's the gray. We're going to be looking here. In 1995, they began at slightly over 70 billion and they rose. You see it is not sudden, it is not sharp. And so a perfect adverb that we see here would be steadily. Now it says, however, from 2000, the trend blank in numbers of calls, ending in 2002 at the same amount as the start of the period. So we're still looking at local fixed line. We are looking for a verb because we see here the noun. So we have to understand what the trend did. And just like it gradually increased, we see it gradually declined. And if we look at our options, we see here showed a gradual decline. So showed is going to be our verb in this case. And so that would make the most sense. The trend showed a gradual decline. Now our last body paragraph, it says turning to national, international fixed calls and mobile calls. Mobile calls in 1995 blank around 2 billion minutes. So we're looking at mobiles, that is in black. You basically want to talk about what the data was in 1995. So here we're not talking about a change. We're just saying the data was this number. And a great way to do that would be to say that it stood. So it stood at around 2 billion minutes. If you used stood on, for example, that would be incorrect just because on is the incorrect preposition. Stood on would be a physical way to stand. So you are standing on the subway platform, for example. Stood at is the correct way to talk about data. Next, we see over the next 4 years, they showed a gradual rise. Again, we're still talking about mobiles, with blank call numbers from 2000 to 2002. So we're looking at 2000 to 2002, what happened? And if you look at this gradual increase from 1995 to 1999, you see it's somewhat different in 2000 to 2002. It's actually a greater increase. So if we're looking here at our options, it would not be a marginal rise because it is more dramatic than that. And so the best option here would be there was a considerable increase in call numbers. Now our last two questions. International fixed calls, which is going to be the white blank, starting at just under 40 billion minutes of calls in 1995, then grew steadily blank. So let's look at the first half, international fixed calls. Now, if you see, it started at just under 40 billion and then it grew steadily. Now, we are talking about national and international, but we've just talked about mobiles. And you see how they both follow a similar trend. So national and international, they have risen gradually, and mobiles have also risen. So the best option here would be international fixed calls showed a similar pattern, starting at just under 40 billion minutes of calls in 1995, then grew steadily. And if we look here, the only possible option would be 2. because you're talking about the final result. So it grew steadily to around 60 billion minutes of calls in 2002. So always make sure you're paying attention to your prepositions and your filler words that are also very important when it comes to your score. Let's look at our final example here. We've got two pie charts. The pie charts below show the percentage of electricity production by fuel source in France in 1990 and 2010. Fill in the gaps with the correct word from the options. So we've got our different segments here. We're going to be comparing, we're going to be looking at the overall trend, and we're going to be looking at the data from 1990 and 2010. Now, same thing, you can pause here and input these options in the writing prompt, or we can do it together. So I'm going to start with the introduction. It says, the pie charts compare the amount of electricity created from 5 different sources of fuel in France in 1990 and 2010. These were oil, natural gas, and nuclear power. That's a great introduction. Let's move to our overview. It says, overall, the use of nuclear power for generating electricity in France, blank. Now, we see the use of nuclear power. So nuclear power is in red, and it says overall nuclear power, it definitely increased, and it's actually quite an increase. So it's looking at 17% all the way to 67. That is a huge increase. So we're looking for a verb because it says the use of nuclear power. We want to know what that did. And if we look at our options, the only correct option would be increased considerably. Remember, considerably is a great adverb to talk about how something increased. Let's continue. However, the use of natural gas, blank, over the 2 decades. So we're looking at natural gas, which is yellow, and that did the opposite. So it declined, and the fact that we see however shows a great contrasting connective. So we know it's going to be something about declining, and the best option would be declined sharply, because again, it is quite a notable difference from 28 to 4%. In addition, oil and coal saw declines, and hydropower showed a slight decrease, blank consumption. So again, just hydropower in orange from 6% to 2%. It showed a slight decrease in consumption. So that is the correct preposition. Make sure, of course, you're not forgetting the importance of your prepositions. Let's go ahead into our first body paragraph. In 1990, nuclear power as a source of energy stood at 17% of electricity production in France. Natural gas and coal, both blank, 28%. And so again, this is just a different way to say what the data is or what the data was. And so the best option here would be accounted for, because we still need a verb, and account, to account for something, is an excellent verb. Continuing on, oil was not far behind, standing at just over blank energy production. Now this is a bit difficult. We'll have to look at oil, which is green. So we're looking at how oil was not far behind natural gas and coal. Let's think about 22% in the midst of all of these categories. So we see there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 categories. So 22% would actually be a fifth of the entire energy production. So that's how we get this answer here. In the last sentence, however, hydropower indicated a small proportion of energy use in 1990. Okay, let's finish off. It says, in contrast, oil and coal saw declines by 2010. So here we're looking at 2010. They both followed the same pattern and dropped to blank as a source of fuel for electricity. So again, we're looking at oil and coal specifically. We see that oil and coal, again, blue and green, they dropped to 13%. Most strikingly, nuclear power became the most relied on form of energy, comprising blank of energy production. So nuclear power is in red. We see another number here comprising 67%. And that is just looking at another way to talk about your data and to be specific. And our last question here, A jump of blank in 2 decades. So we're looking at a jump. So we're looking at the data from 1990 to 2010. If you subtract 17% from 67%, you get 50. And 50 is 1/2, or you could say 2/4. And there you have it. That is the correct answer. Great job with these 2 exercises. Let's quickly wrap up this lesson. Let's look at some do's and don'ts. First off, for do's, you definitely want to analyze your charts well so that you know how you can describe the data. And keep your grammar in mind as you're doing that. A great way to do that is to practice your grammar ahead of time and increase your synonyms and vocabulary. Keep these helpful charts in mind and the columns that we used. They can only help you on test day. Things you shouldn't do: definitely don't start writing the essay immediately. You need time to digest the data, to see how it changes, and to understand which words to use. Try not to reuse the same words for changes. We've given you so many different options, so I hope that you can really use that to your advantage. And of course, don't use the incorrect tense. We did some work today with present perfect versus past simple, so make sure you're keeping that in mind. And also, of course, future projections, which are also included at times in writing task 1. This was a great lesson full of vocabulary and grammar, so job well done. I hope you'll continue to practice these skills, and you can do so by visiting us at www.bestmytest.com/IELTS. We've got a lot of great lessons and practice tests that you can use to really put these skills to the test. Once again, great job, and thank you for joining me today. Have a great day.